A 31,000-ton battleship is about to sail into a narrow fjord. One torpedo could trap her there forever. Behind her, 9 destroyers. Ahead of her, 8 enemy warships with nothing left to lose. What happened over the next 4 hours would change the entire German Navy for the rest of World War II. And the most unbelievable part, a flimsy canvas biplane flying at just 85 knots and carrying 2 tiny bombs would do something no airplane had ever done before in the history of war. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before a single shell was fired on April 13, 1940, the result of this battle was already being decided by something most people never think about when they think about war. Iron ore. Narvik, a small port town in northern Norway, handled about 9 million tons of Swedish iron ore every single year. When winter ice closed the Baltic port of Luleå, Narvik became the only route. Germany's steel production, the tanks, the ships, the planes, the entire war machine, depended heavily on this one supply line. Whoever controlled Narvik controlled Germany's ability to fight an industrial war. So when Germany launched Operation Weserübung on April 9, 1940, the invasion of Norway and Denmark, Narvik was one of the main targets. 10 of Germany's best destroyers carrying 2,000 mountain troops raced through Arctic waters to take the port. They succeeded. The troops landed, Narvik fell. But here's the problem that nobody in Berlin fully planned for. And it's a problem that would destroy half the German destroyer fleet in just 4 days. Those 10 destroyers needed to refuel and leave right away. The plan called for 2 fuel tankers to be waiting at Narvik, ready to fill up each destroyer so they could race back to Germany before the Royal Navy showed up. Only 1 tanker arrived, and that 1 tanker took 7 to 8 hours to refuel each destroyer. One at a time. Do the math. 10 destroyers, 8 hours each. That's 80 hours. More than 3 full days just for refueling. This is how wars are lost. Not in explosions, but in bad planning. If you value history that explains the math behind the battles, subscribe. Because the numbers tell the real story. The Royal Navy wasn't going to give them 3 days. The Royal Navy wasn't going to give them 3 hours. This planning failure, a decision made weeks before the battle, sealed the fate of every German destroyer in that fjord. But the German crews didn't know that yet. And what they were about to go through would become one of the most crushing naval battles of the entire war. Now, to understand what happened on April 13th, you need to know what happened on April 10th. Because when the British showed up the first time, things didn't go perfectly for either side. On April 10th, Captain Bernard Warburton Lee led 5 British destroyers into Ofot Fjord in a surprise dawn attack. They caught the Germans completely off guard, sinking 2 destroyers and damaging several others. Commodore Friedrich Bonte, commander of the entire German destroyer force, was killed when his flagship Wilhelm Heidkamp was hit by a torpedo. But, as Warburton Lee pulled back, 5 German destroyers that had been hiding inside side fjords came out and ambushed his force. 2 British destroyers were sunk. Warburton Lee himself was killed by a direct hit on his bridge. He was given the Victoria Cross after his death, the first of the entire war. So the first Battle of Narvik was a bloody draw. 2 German destroyers sunk. 2 British destroyers sunk. Both commanders dead. But here's what the surviving German captains now understood. They were trapped. 8 destroyers remained, but they were burning through their limited fuel just moving around inside the fjord. Ammunition was critically low, and the Royal Navy wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. British signals intelligence picked up German radio messages on April 12th. The messages told a desperate story. Critically low ammunition, almost empty fuel tanks. Berlin's answer, hold Narvik at all costs or sink the ships. The men aboard those 8 destroyers had just received their death sentence. They just didn't know the exact time yet. It was about to be delivered by a man standing on the bridge of the most dangerous ship in the Royal Navy. Vice Admiral William Whitworth had a decision to make that would either win him a place in naval history or get a 31,000-ton battleship stuck in a Norwegian fjord forever. HMS Warspite, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship that sat 32 feet deep in the water, was never built to operate in narrow coastal waters. Ofot Fjord stretched about 30 miles inland, averaging around 1,400 yards wide with steep cliffs rising on both sides. For a ship 640 feet long, this was like driving a bus through an alley. A single torpedo hit could flood enough compartments to ground her on the fjord bottom, where she'd sit, useless and impossible to move, until the Germans either captured or destroyed her. Every officer on Whitworth's staff understood this. Risk. Some of them probably thought he was out of his mind. He ordered Warspite into the fjord anyway. Why? Because of what Warspite brought to the fight. 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. Maximum range exceeding 30,000 yards, over 17 miles. Against destroyers with at most 5-inch guns and dwindling ammunition, Warspite wasn't just an advantage. She was an executioner. Whitworth's battle plan was careful and organized. Warspite would lead 9 destroyers into the fjord in a well-planned formation. 4 were tribal-class ships, HMS Bedouin, Punjab, Eskimo, and Cossack, each armed with 8 4.7-inch guns. The remaining 5, Icarus, Hero, Forester, Foxhound, and Kimberly, carried 4 to 6 guns each. Minesweepers would go ahead of the force. The tribal-class destroyers would handle close-range combat, and Warspite's 15-inch guns would wipe out anything that tried to stand and fight. Captain Victor Crutchley commanded Warspite under Whitworth's direction. The weather barely cooperated. Snow squalls and low visibility would make aiming harder, but also give the fleet some cover on the way in. At about 12:30 p.m. on April 13, 1940, the British force entered Ofot Fjord. But before a single gun was fired, something extraordinary happened. Something involving that flimsy biplane I mentioned at the beginning. And what it accomplished had never been done before in all of naval history. Early in the approach, Warspite launched her Fairy Swordfish, floatplane for scouting. Now picture this airplane for a moment. Open cockpit, canvas-covered biplane, top speed of about 85 knots, slower than most cars on a modern highway. It carried 2 100-pound anti-submarine bombs, tiny by naval standards. Flown by Petty Officer Frederick Rice with Lieutenant Commander Walter Brown as the observer, the Swordfish puttered over the fjord landscape, looking for threats. They found one in Herjungsfjord near Björkvik. The German submarine U-64 was sitting on the surface. A submarine, one of the most feared weapons in naval warfare, caught completely in the open by a plane that looked like it belonged in the last war. Rice attacked immediately. His 2 small bombs hit their mark. U-64 broke apart and sank. Most of her crew died in the freezing water. This was the first time in all of history that a submarine had been destroyed by an aircraft operating completely alone, without any surface ship support. A milestone achieved by a plane made of wood, canvas, and sheer courage. Rice received the Distinguished Service Medal. Brown received the Distinguished Service Cross, but more importantly, their attack took out a submarine that could have ambushed Warspite during her approach, possibly changing the entire outcome of the battle. With the submarine threat gone, Whitworth pushed forward. His destroyers spread out ahead, and somewhere in the snow and mist, 8 German destroyers were waiting, knowing the British were coming, knowing they couldn't run, and knowing they probably couldn't win. What happened next would unfold in 3 brutal phases, and the third phase, deep inside a dead-end fjord called Rumbaksfjord, would produce the single most dramatic moment of the entire battle. The first German destroyer the British came across was Erich Kühlner. She had been damaged in earlier fighting and was running at reduced capability, slower, harder to steer, with weakened weapons. She never had a chance. Multiple British destroyers closed in on her while Warspite's 15-inch guns added their crushing weight. Imagine what a shell weighing nearly a ton does to a destroyer. The answer is, it doesn't just damage the ship, it tears it to pieces. Erich Kühlner was hit again and again, broke apart, and sank. 31. German sailors died. 39 more were wounded. First blood to the British. 7 German destroyers remained in Narvik Harbor. Erich Giese tried to break out and take on the British force. She had engine trouble, but her captain chose to fight rather than simply wait to be blown apart at anchor. It was a brave decision. It was also a fatal one. Warspite's main guns locked onto her. Multiple 15-inch shells struck home. Erich Giese was abandoned and sank. Meanwhile, Dieter von Reuter, so badly damaged from the first battle that she could barely move, acted as a floating gun battery, firing from her fixed position until every last round of ammunition was used up. Then her crew set off demolition charges and abandoned ship. She sank into the harbor, destroyed. 3 German destroyers taken out in the outer fight. 5 remained, and those 5 were now pulling back deeper into the fjord system toward a place from which there would be no escape. Captain Erich Bay, now commanding the German force from Wolfgang Zenker after Bonte's death in the first battle, understood the situation right away. His destroyers couldn't match Warspite's firepower. His ammunition was nearly gone. His fuel tanks were almost dry. Standing and fighting in open water meant total destruction. So Bay ordered a fighting retreat toward Rombaksfjord, a narrow inlet branching off the main fjord. It gave temporary cover behind headlands and tight stretches. That would make British gunnery harder. But Rombaksfjord was a dead end, a trap. Bay knew it. His captains knew it. Every sailor aboard those 5 destroyers knew they were sailing into a coffin. 4 destroyers, Wolfgang Zenker, Bernd von Arnim, Hans Ludemann, and Hermann Kühne, carried out the retreat while firing back at the chasing British ships. Hermann Kühne tried to escape into a different inlet, Herjungsfjord, but HMS Eskimo raced ahead of the main force, cut her off, and hit her with a torpedo. Hermann Kühne broke apart and sank in shallow water. 4 German destroyers left. All 4 now cornered in Rombaksfjord, and HMS Eskimo, the ship that had just made that kill, was about to pay an extraordinary price for pressing the chase. What happened to her in the next few minutes is one of the most remarkable survival stories of the entire war. Commander St. John Micklethwaite aboard HMS Eskimo pushed his ship into the narrow entrance of Rombaksfjord, chasing the retreating Germans. The fjord walls closed in. The water narrowed. Room to move shrank to almost nothing. This was exactly what the Germans wanted. Georg Thiele and Hans Ludemann had set themselves up in ambush, tucked behind headlands, torpedo tubes pointed at the narrow approach channel. They had almost no gun ammunition left, but they still had torpedoes. At about 3:45 p.m., Georg Thiele fired a torpedo salvo at the approaching British destroyers. One torpedo hit HMS Eskimo directly. The explosion was catastrophic. It completely blew off Eskimo's entire bow section in front of the bridge. Imagine standing on the bridge of a destroyer and looking forward to see nothing. 15 men were gone. In a second. No speeches, no warning, just steel, water, and silence. If moments like this deserve to be remembered properly, not simplified, not dramatized, subscribe. Because this history disappears when no one tells it accurately. By every reasonable measure, HMS Eskimo should have sunk within minutes. A destroyer with no bow, in freezing Norwegian waters, under enemy fire, inside a dead-end fjord. She didn't sink. Damage control crews working in flooding compartments in freezing cold water while the ship groaned and lurched around them, sealed the forward bulkheads. Pumps ran non-stop. Eskimo backed out of Rombaksfjord stern first, with her surviving crew keeping her afloat through sheer will and training. She would eventually be towed all the way back to Britain, get a completely new bow, and return to combat service. She fought for the rest of the war, Arctic convoys, D-Day, everything. She survived it all. The ship they couldn't kill. But Georg Thiele's moment of success was short-lived. British destroyers Forester, Hero, and Bedouin poured heavy fire into her. Badly damaged and unable to move, Georg Thiele ran aground. Around 4 p.m., her crew set scuttling charges and abandoned ship. She was destroyed by her own crew, rather, then surrendered. Hans Ludemann pulled back deeper into the fjord, but deeper meant closer to the dead end. There was nowhere left to go. The math of this battle had been merciless from the very beginning, and now it reached its only possible conclusion. 3 German destroyers remained: Wolfgang Zenker, Berndy, von Arnim, and Hans Ludemann, cornered at the very end of Rombaksfjord. Behind them, a rock wall. Ahead of them, 9 British destroyers and a battleship. Their gun ammunition was gone. Their torpedo tubes were empty. Their fuel tanks held nothing. But fumes. There was nothing left to fight with. Captain Bay gave the order every naval commander dreads. Abandon ship and scuttle. Crews set off demolition charges throughout all 3 ships. The men went over the side into freezing water and scrambled, ashore onto the rocky Norwegian coast. Then the charges went off. One after another, 3 German destroyers broke apart and sank to the bottom of Rumbaksfjord. By late afternoon, Vice Admiral Whitworth received confirmation from his destroyer, captains in the Swordfish scout plane. Every single German destroyer in Ofotfjord was either sunk or scuttled. 8 destroyers and 1 submarine destroyed in a single afternoon's fighting. The Second Battle of Narvik was over. Here are the numbers, and they tell a devastating story. German. Losses. All 8 destroyers destroyed. 4 sunk in action, 4 scuttled by their own crews. About 17,600 tons of warship gone. 128 German sailors killed. 67 wounded. U-64 sunk with most of her crew. The survivors, roughly 2,100 German sailors, were stranded in Norway. Under Lieutenant Commander Hans Erdmenger, they were organized into a makeshift naval infantry unit. Sailors fighting as soldiers. That's how badly the Kriegsmarine had been hurt. British losses. Not a single ship sunk. HMS Eskimo severely damaged. HMS Cossack damaged with 11 killed. HMS Punjab and Foxhound with lesser damage. Total British dead. Between 28 and 41, depending on which ships and time frames different historical sources include, against 128 German dead and the complete destruction of the enemy force. But the true cost to Germany went far beyond the men and ships lost on April 13th. Germany started the war with 21 destroyers. After both battles of Narvik, 2 lost on April 10th, 8 more on April 13th. Only 11 remained. Nearly half the Kriegsmarine's entire destroyer force was wiped out in just 4 days. Building a destroyer took about 2 years from the time the keel was laid to when the ship was ready to sail. These weren't losses that could be replaced next month or even next year, and the iron ore, Narvik's shipments to Germany dropped from about 9 million tons per year all the way down to roughly 180,000 tons in 1940. That's a cut of more than 98%. German steel production fell by about 37% that year. Fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer warships. The ripple effect spread through every branch of Germany's military for the rest of 1940 and beyond. Now, here's the part most videos about Narvik won't tell you, because it's not about heroism or dramatic explosions. It's about decisions made months and years before a single shell was fired. First, the refueling failure. The entire operation assumed 2 tankers would be waiting at Narvik. One never arrived. That single missing tanker trapped the destroyer. Force for 3 extra days, just enough time for the Royal Navy to respond with overwhelming force. Second, torpedo problems. German torpedoes in early 1940 suffered from serious technical failures. Faulty depth settings caused torpedoes to run too deep, passing harmlessly underneath their targets. Unreliable magnetic detonators failed to go off in many cases. The Germans had designed their destroyers around torpedoes as the main weapon, and that main weapon didn't work reliably. British torpedoes used simpler contact detonators that actually worked. Third, ship design choices. German destroyers were built for fast battles in the open ocean, quick, heavily armed with torpedoes, designed to dash in, fire, and escape. They were never built to fight a long gun battle while trapped in a fjord with no fuel to maneuver. British destroyers focused on gun power and proved more effective in the close-range, gun-heavy fight that Narvik became. Fourth, the gap in industrial strength. Britain had 184 destroyers in April 1940. Germany had 21. Britain could take losses and keep going. Germany could not afford to lose a single ship, let alone 10. This basic difference in replacement ability meant that even a tie at Narvik would have been a strategic defeat for Germany. What actually happened, complete destruction, was a catastrophe. The battle was lost in planning rooms, shipyards, and torpedo workshops long before it was lost in Ofotfjord. The men who fought this battle carried it with them, some to glory, some to death. Vice Admiral Whitworth was praised for his bold decision to risk a battleship in tight coastal waters. Captain Victor Crutchley later received a knighthood, Commander Philip Vian of HMS Cossack, who had already made headlines by boarding the German supply ship Altmark 2 months earlier, received further recognition. On the German side, Captain Erich Bay received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on May 9, 1940, for his leadership during both battles. He was promoted to Führer, der Zerstörer, commander of destroyers, replacing the dead Commodore Bonte. But Bay's story doesn't end there. 3 years later, on December 26, 1943, he commanded the battleship Scharnhorst at the Battle of North Cape. In many ways, it was a mirror image of Narvik, a German capital ship trapped by stronger British forces with no way out. Scharnhorst was sunk. Of her crew of 1,968 men, only 36 survived. Erich Bay went down with his ship. He had survived one trap in a Norwegian fjord. He didn't survive the second. And HMS Eskimo, the destroyer that lost her entire bow and refused to die, was towed to Britain, rebuilt, and returned to the fight. She served throughout the war, Arctic convoys, Mediterranean operations, the D-Day landings at Normandy. She survived everything the war threw at her. The ship that should have sunk in Rombaksfjord on April 13, 1940, outlasted the entire conflict. Some ships, like some people, simply refused to go down. The Second Battle of Narvik wasn't decided by luck. It wasn't decided by one brilliant move or one heroic act. It was decided by the weight of 1,000 decisions piling up. Ship designs chosen years earlier, logistics plans that assumed everything would work perfectly, torpedo systems that were never properly tested, and the basic industrial math of a nation with 21 destroyers fighting a nation with 184. The German crews at Narvik fought with extraordinary skill and courage. Georg Thiele's torpedo that blew off Eskimo's bow was a masterful shot, fired by men who knew they were going to die. Erich Bay's fighting retreat was textbook tactical leadership under impossible conditions. These were not poor sailors. They were brave men destroyed by system failures they couldn't control. Wars are decided by courage, but they're won by logistics, technology, and math. Narvik proved that in 4 brutal hours on a freezing Norwegian afternoon. If this video changed how you think about naval warfare, hit subscribe. I break down military history with the math included and the myths stripped away. Drop one word in the comments describing what Narvik represents to you.